The rumble of 8 Harley-Davidsons rolled through the sleeping streets of Asheville, North Carolina, as the Iron Brotherhood made their usual late-night patrol. Ryder Cole, president of the local chapter, rode at the front. At 52, his leather jacket carried more history than most men twice his age. Scars marked his knuckles, and silver threaded through his beard, but his sharp gray eyes missed nothing. He had seen things in his life that would break lesser men. He had buried brothers. He had held dying friends on the side of highways while the world continued spinning indifferently around him. He had sat in hospital waiting rooms, staring at linoleum floors, learning the particular silence that precedes devastating news. Grief was not a stranger to Ryder Cole. It was practically a club member. But nothing, not one single thing across 52 years of hard living had prepared him for what he saw through the open bay doors of Carter's garage at 3 o'clock in the morning. Light spilled onto the wet pavement like a warm wound in the cold night. Ryder raised a hand. The engines went silent one by one, a rolling thunder that died into something almost reverent, the way sound hushes itself inside a church. 8 men sat on their bikes and stared. Inside the garage stood a tiny figure on a wooden crate, barely tall enough to see over the workbench. A little girl in oversized coveralls struggled with a wrench twice the size of her hand, her small arms shaking with effort. The tool slipped. She caught herself on the workbench edge. She pressed her forehead down against the cool metal surface for a moment, just a moment, and her small shoulders rose and fell with something that looked less like exhaustion and more like a person trying not to completely fall apart. Grease stained her cheeks. Tears mixed with oil, and she was completely, heartbreakingly alone. Ryder swung off his bike before he'd made a conscious decision to move. That was the thing about instinct. It didn't ask permission. His boots hit the concrete, and he walked toward the open bay with his hands loose at his sides, deliberately visible, deliberately slow. He'd spent enough time around frightened things, animals, people, kids, to know that size could be terrifying when you didn't expect it. "Hey there," he said, keeping his voice lower than the night breeze. The girl spun around so fast she nearly toppled off the crate. She caught the workbench again, wrench still clutched in both hands like a weapon she wasn't sure how to use but wasn't about to surrender. Her eyes were enormous, brown and wet and absolutely ferocious in the way that only a child who has already been hurt can make their eyes go ferocious, like an animal that has learned the world has teeth. She looked about 7 years old, maybe 8, small for whatever age she was. "I'm not stealing nothing," she said immediately, her chin lifting about 3 inches higher than it had any right to go given the circumstances. Her voice had the particular roughness of someone who had been crying for a long time. "This is my daddy's garage." Ryder stopped moving. He crouched down slowly until he was closer to her eye level, though even crouching he was still considerably larger than she was. He pulled off his sunglasses, unnecessary at 3 a.m., but old habits, and tucked them into his jacket pocket. "I can see that. Carter's garage. Your daddy is Tom Carter?" Something shifted in her face. Not softening exactly, more like a crack in a wall that has been built very recently and very desperately. "Yes, sir," she whispered. Behind Ryder, he heard the careful footsteps of his brothers approaching, keeping their distance, reading the room the way men who have spent decades together learn to read rooms. He heard Hatchet, 6'4", 300 pounds of former Army Ranger, make a sound in his throat that no one who knew him would ever have expected. Something soft. Something broken open. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Ryder asked. "Gracie." "Gracie Carter." He nodded like it was the most dignified name he'd ever heard. "What are you doing out here at 3 in the morning, Gracie? Where's your daddy?" The crack in the wall became a fracture. Her jaw worked. She looked down at the wrench in her hands and then back up at him. And he watched her make the decision, that terrible, exhausted decision that people make when they have been carrying something too heavy for too long and they simply cannot carry it alone anymore. Daddy's sick. He's been sick for a while. He's inside sleeping because the medicine makes him sleep a lot. She paused. Mr. Henderson said he was going to tow away Mr. Polanski's truck if it wasn't fixed by tomorrow morning. He said Daddy owed him for 3 months of lot fees, and if that truck wasn't fixed, he was going to make trouble. She said the last 2 words the way a child says them, weighted with all the adult gravity she'd absorbed from hearing them in adult conversations not meant for her. Daddy was going to get up and fix it, but I told him to stay in bed because he was shaking real bad today, and She stopped, swallowed. I watched Daddy fix things my whole life. I know how. I'm almost done. Ryder looked past her at the truck. It was a 1987 Ford F-150, engine exposed, a mess of parts laid out with surprising organization on a shop cloth beside the crate she stood on. He was no master mechanic, but he could see what she'd been attempting, an alternator replacement. Halfway done. Done carefully, actually, for someone who could barely reach the engine block. He looked back at her. 7 years old, maybe 8, out here alone in the middle of the night trying to save her sick father's business with a wrench she could barely lift. Ryder Cole had not cried in 11 years. He knew the exact date of the last time because it was the day they put his road brother Marcus in the ground after a drunk driver made a left turn into eternity. He had not cried since, not from pride exactly, but from the kind of grief that goes so deep it stops producing tears and starts producing something harder and quieter and permanent. He felt that something shift now. He cleared his throat. "Gracie," he said carefully, "do you think you could show me what you've got done so far?" She blinked. "You know about engines?" "A little bit." She studied him with the unnerving directness of children who have been forced to develop early instincts about adults. She was measuring him the way you measure a floor before you trust it with your weight. "Okay," she decided. What happened next would be told and retold at chapter meetings and rallies and roadside diners for years afterward, growing in the telling the way good stories always do. But the truth of it was simple enough. Ryder called back to his brothers with 2 words, "Come on." And 8 men who collectively carried enough tattoos, scars, arrests, heartbreaks, wars, and hard miles to fill a library walked into Tom Carter's garage and got to work. Hatchett, who had spent 4 years as an Army motor pool sergeant before life took him in different directions, took one look at the engine and cracked his knuckles. "Sweet girl," he said, and it wasn't entirely clear whether he was talking to Gracie or the truck. He gently took the wrench from her small hands. "You got the hard part done," he told her, not as condescension, but as simple fact. "You loosened the old bolts. That's always the worst part." Gracie watched him with narrowed eyes, still not fully trusting, arms crossed over the chest of her 2 big coveralls. "Daddy says the worst part is always whatever part you're currently doing." Hatchett looked at her for a moment and then laughed, a real laugh, the full kind, the kind that comes from somewhere genuine. "Your daddy sounds like a smart man." "He is," she said, with a ferocity that made several large men find sudden need to look elsewhere for a moment. Preacher, so called because he actually had been one, briefly, before the road called louder than the pulpit, slipped away quietly. He came back 20 minutes later with 2 bags from the only all-night diner that would be open at this hour, 3 miles up the main road. Coffee for the men, hot chocolate and a grilled cheese sandwich for Gracie. He set it on the workbench without announcement. She looked at it. Then she looked at him. "My daddy says you don't take food from strangers," she said. "Your daddy is right," Preacher said. "You shouldn't." He pulled up a stool and sat down at the workbench and picked up his own coffee cup. "But I figure if we're going to be working together, we're not quite strangers anymore. You're the shop supervisor. I'm just labor." She considered this with tremendous seriousness. She picked up the grilled cheese. Ryder, meanwhile, had gone to the small door at the back of the garage that led into the attached living quarters. He knocked softly. Knocked again.
When the door opened, the man on the other side looked like he had once been big and capable, and was now being slowly hollowed out by something that left the shape of him mostly intact, but took the substance. Tom Carter was perhaps 45. He looked 70. His eyes, when they focused on Ryder, on this large, silver-bearded stranger at his doorstep at 3 in the morning, went immediately past him to the garage, to his daughter. Gracie,
"She's fine," Ryder said quickly. "She's fine, Tom. She's eating a grilled cheese and supervising my guys. I promise you she is completely safe." He paused. "She called herself the shop supervisor." Tom Carter stared at him. Then something happened to Tom Carter's face that Ryder recognized because he had felt it himself. The particular collapse that happens when someone has been holding everything together alone for so long that a single unexpected kindness lands like a structural failure. Not weakness, the opposite of weakness. The thing that happens when a wall built out of pure necessity finally gets permission to come down. Tom Carter put one hand on the doorframe. "She's been..." He stopped. Tried again. "I've been sick for 8 months. She's been..." He shook his head, unable to finish the sentence in a way that did justice to what his 7-year-old daughter had been doing for 8 months. "I know," Ryder said, though he had only known for 40 minutes. "You got a hell of a kid, Tom." "I know it," whispered Tom. "Come on out and sit with her while we finish up this truck. You can tell me what Henderson's been pulling and we'll figure out what comes next." Tom looked at him for a long moment. "Why?" he asked. Not suspiciously, just honestly. The question of a man who has been without help for long enough that help has started to seem like a concept belonging to some other world. "Why are you doing this?" He thought about it. "Because it's 3 in the morning, and a little girl is in your garage with a wrench she can barely lift trying to protect her daddy. And some things you just don't ride past." The alternator was finished at 4:15. Hatchet fired up the F-150 and the engine turned over clean and strong. Gracie, who had appointed herself official light holder for the last 40 minutes, standing on her crate with a flashlight aimed precisely where she was told, broke into a smile so sudden and so complete that it rearranged every face in the garage. Tom sat in a folding chair against the wall, wrapped in an old blanket someone had found, a cup of coffee going warm in his hands. He watched his daughter receive a solemn high five from a man who had once been deployed to 3 different combat zones. He watched her explain to another large tattooed stranger the exact proper way to put tools back in order on the shop cloth. His eyes were bright. He didn't say much. He didn't have to. Before the Iron Brotherhood rolled out that night, Ryder had a quiet conversation with Preacher, who made a phone call, who knew a woman who ran a non-profit connecting tradespeople with families in medical hardship. He had a separate conversation with a brother named Ox, who ran the chapter's community fund, and who confirmed, quietly, without fanfare, that certain lot fees could be addressed. None of this was announced. None of it was made into something that required Tom Carter's gratitude or Gracie's awareness. It was simply done. The way genuine kindness is always simply done, without architecture or performance. As the men moved toward their bikes, Gracie appeared at the garage door. "Mr. Ryder?" she called. He turned. She was silhouetted against the warm light of the garage, her 2 big coveralls, her grease-streaked face, her chin at that particular angle she seemed to default to, up, always up, like she was perpetually braced against a wind only she could feel. "Thank you," she said, "for helping with Mr. Polamski's truck." "You did most of the hard work," he said. "We just finished what you started." She thought about this. "My daddy says that's what community is," she said. "Finishing what somebody else started when they can't quite get there." 8 men on 8 motorcycles were quiet for a moment. "Your daddy," Hatchet said, from somewhere behind Ryder, his voice considerably rougher than usual, "is a very smart man." "I know it," said Gracie Carter. The Iron Brotherhood rode out of Asheville as the first gray light was beginning to consider the possibility of morning. The streets were still quiet, the city still sleeping.
The cold air came off the mountains clean and sharp and tasting faintly of pine. Ryder rode at the front, as always.
He thought about a 7-year-old girl standing on a crate with a wrench in her hands and tears on her face, and absolutely no intention of surrendering. He thought about what it meant to stand in the dark and keep working. He thought about the 10,000 different kinds of courage the world contained, and how the smallest containers sometimes held the most of it. He thought about his road brother, Marcus, 11 years in the ground. He thought about the way Marcus used to say that the whole point of being strong was to stand between hard things and the people who couldn't yet stand alone. The engines rumbled. The mountains held the dark. And somewhere behind them, in a small garage on a quiet street, a man who had been sick for 8 months pulled his daughter into his arms, and they sat together in the warm light, and the truck was fixed, and morning was coming, and for the first time in a long time, tomorrow felt like something other than a weight. Some things you just don't ride past. That's what the road teaches you if you let it. That's what it means to have a code. Paths of honor, where the road meets the right thing.